So good morning, James. Once again, thank you so much for joining us. It's a great pleasure and a true privilege to meet you in person, even remotely. And on behalf of this group, we are very grateful for the generosity of sharing your precious time with us. And we are both all thrilled to be here with you.
Thank you. That's very kind. I'm happy to be here with you, but I would much prefer to be in Brazil.
Well, at least in terms of the weather, for sure.
Just come here. You are welcome here.
I'd love to. I would love to come. Except my Portuguese is terrible.
Oh, we'll provide an invitation for you, James, just to escape from the winter there. So. So, James, this is a group composed by business and thought leaders of many of Brazil's leading companies. And under this leadership program, we are debating critical issues every month, not only about the professional life, but also about life from a broader perspective. And on top of that, we have special sessions with leading thinkers like yourself, who are our guides, to think better about these subjects and also, and of course, to act accordingly. And you don't need introductions, but for the sake of starting this event in a more formal way, I would like to highlight, to all participants that James, Dr. Suzman, is an anthropologist specialized in I don't know the right pronunciation, Khoisan peoples or something like that.
Yes, Khoisan is probably the best.
And in particular, I saw an interview of you of the Jew Hansi. It's something like that, the pronunciation?
Yeah, the proper way. It's complicated because it's a click. So it's Jumasi. It means real, true people. Ju means person, Twa means truth.
Fantastic. Of Southern Africa. And he's the author of the best-selling books, Affluence, let me see here, Without Abundance. Okay, so here it's okay. Affluence Without Abundance, The Disappearing World of the Bushmen, and it's filled with very beautiful photographies taken by James, because he's also a photographer. So it's a very nice book with beautiful photographs. And more recently, work, a deep history from the Stone Age to the age of robots. It's basically a masterpiece, And according to Yuval Harari, who writes here in the back cover, it provides a fascinating exploration that challenges our basic assumption on what work means. And so after receiving his anthropology degree, Dr. Suzman went to Botswana's Eastern Kalahari Desert in 1991 and has been working with Kalahari peoples ever since. He is the recipient of the prestigious Smuts Commonwealth Fellowship in African Studies at Cambridge University, and he is now the director of Anthropos Ltd, which is a think tank that applies anthropological methods to solve contemporary social and economic problems. So, James, without further ado, I'm going to kick off this conversation with 4 or 5 questions and then open to other questions from the members of our group, whom I also greet and thank very much for being here. Okay? Let's go. So I would like to start off, James, with a question about one of the things that impressed me the most when reading your book. The way virtually all of us here in this room see work has been shaped by economists, and the basic story of economics is that we live in a world where resources are scarce and therefore there is not enough for everyone's wants and needs. So this is the so-called economic problem. And behind this story, there are 2 assumptions, The first is that life before the Industrial Revolution was much harsher because productivity was low. So we had to work more before to survive. And the second is that by automating a lot of work, the Industrial Revolution would allow us to work less than before. And as you show in your wonderful book, the story that economics told us simply doesn't stand up to the facts, right? So could you please share with us how much time our ancestors, hunter-gatherers, probably worked according to current evidence? How did they see work? How did they relate with the future? And finally, how much harm this scarcity mindset, which is a very core of economics, has caused us individually and collectively?
Okay, I'll happily answer. I'll give quite a long answer if you. It's probably the easiest way to do it. And I hope I'm enunciating my English clearly enough for those of you who aren't used to hearing English all the time, so that you can at least follow it carefully. I think I'll start just with this idea that you brought up at the beginning about automation and development of artificial intelligence and industrialization, basically diminishing the possibility that it might diminish our workload, because that was really the starting point for me of this project. Now, if we go back a century or 2 centuries or 3 centuries to the various thinkers who shaped much contemporary philosophy, from people like, well, we go back from John Maynard Keynes to the Renaissance thinkers, there was always this idea that automation, advancement, and technology will liberate us from a life of doing difficult drudge work that doesn't bring us a great deal of happiness and doesn't bring us a great deal of joy. And there were many great thinkers who celebrated this idea, of whether it was Bertrand Russell and so on. And the idea was really simply, and it sort of spoke to a sort of sense of optimism that came at the birth of the industrial age, that we were on a path to lives which would be much more fulfilling because we'd be free to think and do what we really wished. Yet, despite the fact that we've actually crossed many of the important thresholds that economists like John Maynard Keynes identified and said would need to be met before we could begin enjoying a life of leisure, we still seem to work just as hard as we ever did. And in fact, for many of us, we don't actually ever leave our work behind. You know, there's a phrase in America at the moment, in the States, that's popular, called workism. And workism refers to that sense that many people have all the time that they should be doing something, that even when you take leisure, that you should be working on something. So it's that feeling we have, you know, I'm going to use a dated metaphor of a BlackBerry, but when we're constantly checking our emails on a Sunday afternoon when we should be dining and chatting with our families, this kind of constant sense of pressure. And so this was a question that I wanted to ask. And the reason I wanted to ask this was that my anthropological studies, and many of those who preceded me, who worked with people like the Zhuangzi, who we talked about earlier, who are arguably the oldest continuous hunting and gathering culture that we know of, and certainly the most geographically stable, but also many other communities that primarily hunt and gather wild foods for a living in much the same way that our ancestors did, certainly before 11, 12,000 years ago. And what was interesting was that the work with these groups, and in particular the Zhuangzi, which began in the 1950s and 1960s, when people perceived, and there was this very common notion, that human history was a history of progress and a history of increased comfort and increased relaxation. And certainly this was the idea behind this idea that industrialization would liberate us from having to do hard work. And of course, like many of these ideas, that human history was this great journey of progress, nobody bothered testing it until the 1960s. And in the 1960s, a group of anthropologists went to the Kalahari Desert, which they believed to be home to, firstly, hunter-gatherers who lived in the scarcest and toughest environment that was known for any contemporary hunting and gathering society to live in. So they thought they would be a very good analog of how our ancient hunting and gathering ancestors might have lived. The other reason was that they assumed that these populations, because they were isolated from the outside world by this huge desert and by the lack of water, that they represented some kind of continuity with the past. Now, when they went to do this initial period of fieldwork, they assumed that they would discover that the hunter-gatherers who lived there lived constantly on the edge of starvation, led lives that, in the words of the philosopher Thomas Hobbes, were nasty, brutish, and short, and were in a constant state of competition with one another as they battled for scarce resources, this idea of sort of primeval war, in a sense. Now, they were fairly shocked to discover when they went there, and there was one anthropologist, Richard Lee, who was at the time based at the University of Toronto, who led the study. And what he did was he did a series of economic input-output analyses where he attached himself to a group of Zhengmasi, and he carefully measured what they ate, how much time they spent securing their food resources, and how difficult life, in fact, was for them. And his conclusions basically transformed the way we think about hunter-gatherers. He discovered that for the time period that he did this study, this period of 2 months, which was by no means the easiest season of the year for hunter-gatherers, he discovered that on average, men worked around 17 hours a week, and they were responsible primarily for hunting, and adult women worked typically around only 15 hours a week. And on the basis of that, they met all their nutritional needs. What was also interesting at the time was that he discovered that the Zhengmasi did not live constantly on the edge of starvation, which is also what was assumed about them. In fact, he discovered that based on their nutritional intake and outtake at the time, they were certainly better fed than the average European in the 1950s and 1960s, in France, in Belgium, in mainland Europe. So this was a sort of shocking enough discovery as it was. Critically, he also noted that what they did was they spent most of their time, so the time that they weren't involved in hunting and gathering, most of their time on activities that we would call leisure activities. Now, some of these leisure activities, of course, involved work. Work is a creative process. Many of us, I cook for leisure, for instance. And with the Zhengmasi, they were actually very good at relaxing for their leisure time. And what happens, and certainly one thing you learn as an anthropologist, most of life in a hunter-gatherer encampment basically involves sitting down under a tree and laughing and talking while people will make jewelry or tell jokes or make stories or discuss or gossip or talk about, the weather and the seasons and where people have seen things or share information. But mostly it's a very relaxed space. Critically, though, what came out of the research from the likes of Lee and others, and then subsequently myself, was a far more interesting idea than the fact that our hunter-gatherer ancestors simply didn't have to work very hard. It's that part of the reason they didn't work very hard is they did not share this idea that economists have repeatedly argued is fundamental to human nature, that we are creatures with infinite desires, and because our desires are so great, everything is by definition scarce. That's certainly how economics defines the problem of scarcity. Why is there scarcity? It's not because there often isn't enough stuff to go around. It's because as soon as we get enough of what we desire, we always seem to want more of it. And so that's why our economies are driven by this fundamental eternal scarcity. Now, what was interesting with the Zhengmasi, and indeed many other hunting and gathering foraging communities, certainly in South America, Central Africa, East Asia, Australasia, and so on, was that they did not share this view that the environment was fundamentally scarce and that humans had insatiable desires, that as soon as we were satisfied with one thing, we worried about getting another thing more than that. In fact, what it suggested was they had a view of their environments as inherently provident and generous. So where Western economic models hold that the world is intrinsically scarce because we have these vast appetites, hunter-gatherer models of how the economic world works is in fact the opposite, is that the world is intrinsically generous and that it is constantly sharing food with individuals. It is not a battle against the elements, but rather it is a process of gift giving and sharing. And sometimes the environment might not be as generous as it is at other times. But the idea is that it's a worldview based not on this assumption that we have vast desires that are impossible to satisfy, but rather that we as a species, and certainly I think this was the case for much of human history and in many different places, that there was this, most people effectively had limited desires that were relatively easy to satisfy. And so they weren't constantly thinking about what they don't have, rather than being able to quite easily get what they do have. So this poses a really fundamental challenge to many of the economic structures and institutions around which we still organize our lives, which are based on what seems to me to be a fraudulent, not fraudulent, a misappropriated set of assumptions about what it means to be human and what human nature is.
Wow, fantastic. That's exactly my second question on human nature. And by the way, James, you mentioned 17 hours for men, because there are people here who works 70 hours in this group, perhaps. So, so it's not 70, guys, it's 17, right? And,
that's correct. 17.
So there is a fascinating video of you produced by Big Think with the provocative title, Anthropologist Debunks Darwin's Most Abused Idea. And in this video, James, you mentioned that when you were 19, you ended up bizarrely, and in your words, right, getting an internship at a bank. And in that bank, you had a manager who constantly reminded you of what he believed was a Darwinian view of the world. You know, it's only about competition, it's a dog world, and business is the survival of the fittest. And this is one of the greatest contradictions that I see nowadays, James, because despite the vast majority of business leaders agree that we live in a world driven by scientific knowledge, the fact is that very few of them take the time to know what science actually says about the topics that are critical for designing their organization, their human organizations. And one of these critical topics is, of course, human nature and how evolution, in fact, took place for ours and other species in the context of competition versus cooperation. So for the lay person, James, what anthropology currently says about human nature, and in your case, personal case, after 30 years documenting, contemporary hunter-gatherers lifestyle and worldviews in local and on the field, what have you learned about human nature?
Okay, well, the first thing I'll do is answer the question what anthropologists tend to think about human nature, because it's a very easy question to answer. The first thing anthropologists ought to say, if any of them have any views on human nature, they should say, I don't know. Human nature is a mysterious thing to unpack and to unravel. It is not something that immediately presents itself to us as an analyst. And the reason we say this is because cultures, different people, different places, and different times have had profoundly different views about what it means to be human. So for anthropologists, and early social anthropology was based on this idea of finding what is universal about our species. What is it that a Trobriand islander in Melanesia has in common with somebody living in the rainforest in Brazil, in the Kalahari Desert, in central London, in Manhattan? What is it that binds us all together? And anthropologists debated and looked, and it's really quite hard to establish what that is. Claude Levi-Strauss, who's probably the most famous 20th century anthropologist and the great gatherer of all these oblique ideas together, what he said was most universal about humans was nobody likes incest. People don't, marry their immediate family members. But beyond that, there wasn't a great deal to say. In many ways, what anthropology is interesting with is it suggests that actually what is human nature is that our cultures are very powerful organizing forces. And our cultures, as different as they may be, like a Junwasi in the Kalahari Desert to a banker, our cultures feel to us, the way we think and the way we structure and organize our thoughts, all feel to us to be natural. That is how it is. So my instinctive idea, our ideas about, what constitutes, let's say, for example, a fair exchange between two strangers and how we feel about it, we think of that as a natural response rather than a cultural one. Our views about who we should marry and who we shouldn't marry, we feel are natural and instinctive. That's something to do with being human rather than being from or of a certain place. Anthropology suggests otherwise. It suggests that people are capable of thinking and rationalizing things in profoundly different ways. And so in many ways, the sort of idea of searching for an absolute human nature is a fool's errand. But it also suggests that it's very interesting to start looking at the ways people in different places and trying to ask the question, why is it that people in this context or that context think of human nature in this way or in that way? And one particular and interesting example of it is this idea that humans are inherently competitive, which certainly in the Western European and be expanding beyond that into the entire Western Hemisphere with the expansion of the colonial empires and so on, is this idea that we are inherently competitive. And there is actually an intellectual history that one can trace, looking at how this idea that we are so deeply competitive came into being and came to become such a mantra. And it's repeated endlessly. It remains very much at the heart of many of the debates about fiscal policy, many of the debates about how we organize our economic institutions, and indeed many political debates in many countries about, who's entitled to welfare, who's entitled to earn what, so on and so forth. But the idea that we are absolutely competitive has become kind of iconified in many of our own economic institutions and attitudes, much like my manager at that particular merchant bank. And it has become sort of widely accepted. Indeed, we sort of build it into many of our legal institutions. I mean, to me, it's interesting that, we'll talk about business as essentially a competitive ecosystem. And that competitive ecosystem reflects our innermost belief, our natural competitiveness towards one another. Yet at the same time, those organizing systems, we sort of quietly acknowledge that actually we do things in reality in very different ways. So for instance, if we look certainly in, pretty much every large country based with reasonably what they call free markets, there are far more rules aimed at restricting cooperation between businesses and collaboration in businesses than now. Competition in some ways has to be enforced. There's antitrust rules, there's anti-monopoly rules, and there's anti-competitive behavior rules, all sorts of things to effectively prevent people from cooperating with one another. Now, humans, when it comes to this question of cooperation, the selfish versus the collective ideal, is one of the principal focuses of most people's debates about what it is to be human. And my answer to this question is to suggest that actually, again, we have profoundly different views about the relationship between the self and others, and these can be mediated by culture. All cultures have this tension between self and other, between what we might call our generous instincts and our more selfish ones. But they'll all be mediated and organized in very different ways. And this is, again, where the example of people like the Smuts and indeed many other hunter-gatherer societies comes in, where, for example, in terms of property relations, they consider it entirely normal to basically own stuff, but share everything. So those societies, while individuals are allowed to own things and they have this idea of property, they don't care a great deal for property, but they have a system called demand sharing, where effectively in those societies, it's basically anybody in your social group is entitled to ask anybody else for a share of what they have. If they are, for example, eating a meal, if they, for example, are, gathered a big chunk of firewood. And it is considered extremely impolite to turn them down. Whereas over here in England, it is considered extremely rude to simply go and ask somebody for a share of what they have. Rather, it's considered polite for that person to perhaps offer what they have. It's a complete inversion of the thinking. So culture mediates the way we engage with these instincts and norms. And what my principal lesson from working with the Zhonghuasi and indeed other hunter-gatherer cultures were that many of these economic ideas that we consider to be fundamental and natural, that I grew up feeling were absolutely fundamental and natural, that we are competitive, that if I give something to somebody, I expect them to always give something back to me in return. There's a process of exchange, that these ideas are not universal. So what it does, and what's the most appealing thing about that for me, is as we look at our world around us, which is, changing, we are changing, and we are being forced to contemplate very difficult changes arising out of whether it's anthropogenic climate change, growing populations, and of course the political trajectories that many of our countries are on at the moment, is that what it invites us to do is embrace the idea that we are capable of all sorts of extraordinary things. We are capable of being very different to what we are now. And that in terms of finding solutions to these problems, it is really important that we don't handcuff ourselves to ideas that have been repeated ad hominem through history.
Fantastic, James. There is this anecdote that we don't know about what fish talk, but for sure it's not about the water. They don't realize they are in the water. So let's question the water that we're swimming. And just before my next question, Angela, perhaps if we could take a picture to register this very special moment here with everyone, please.
Yes, I'll take one, but I need to just wait a second, please, because we have two screens. We are so many guests here. Just a second.
Yeah, that's
a lot of people.
Angela, I'll put my books on the photo if you may allow.
Yeah, me too. Great.
You have a pen here, James.
Very
James,
good. Thank you.
I've also
Maricel,
gifted your book, the one with the black cover, which is the same. I've already gifted it.
There is the Brazilian edition. There should be a Portuguese one in.
But she is in Hong Kong, Maristela. So she doesn't live in Brazil. Yeah.
There's also a Chinese one in Hong Kong.
Oh.
So let's count to 3. 1, 2, 3. Let's see if it was with the books.
Next take.
Okay, next screen. Wait a minute. Okay, 1, 2, 3.
Is it okay?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay.
Thank you.
So James, as you point out in your book, although there is a broad definition of for work, and I'm just quoting here, which you mentioned that is purposefully expending energy or effort on a task to achieve a goal or an end related to meeting our needs or wants. So this is the sort of official definition. Work is in fact a slippery concept, right? Because what is work for one can be leisure for another. So for me, James, the main point to reflect upon is not on the amount of time dedicated to work, as it might be defined in different ways, but to reflect on the amount of time dedicated to miserable work, which is a kind of work that is not self-fulfilling nor fun. And here the evidence is grim, As you know very well, the late Professor David Graeber wrote this book here, Bullshit Jobs, right, back in 2019, to analyze this current widespread presence of meaningless, unfulfilling jobs. And he based his analysis in many surveys, such as one done by the Harvard Business Review, in which about half of 12,000 employees said that they didn't get a feeling of meaning and significance from their work. And on top of that, we had a conversation last year with Jim Clifton, which is the global CEO of Gallup, this big survey institute. And their data is also discouraging. Only about 20% of employees worldwide say that they feel actively engaged with their jobs, while the rest are either disconnected or actively disengaged. So can we link these dismal figures of widespread disengagement, unhappiness, and mental health problems in the business world, with the prevalence of this industrial age mindset in our organizations, in the sense that work is still, fragmented into repetitive, separated pieces without a clear purpose, and companies only think about growth, maximization, and efficiency.
Yeah, the idea of work is such a big question, and the idea of defining work. So I'll start again at the very beginning of your question, where, one of the things I really struggled to do when writing the book, and I sat down to think about it, is what is a universal definition of work? Because in a very fundamental sense, in certainly in Western Europe, we tend to associate the term work most obviously with our jobs. I'm going to work means I'm going to get on the train and go to London and sit in my office all day long and twiddle my thumbs and get annoyed with my co-workers and come home and be tired. And that is what most people think of work. Yet, of course, we use the word work in many other contexts. We work at our relationships. We work at our bodies if we're really keen to go to the gym. And of course, we spend our time, many of us spend our time when we are not at work, at our jobs, doing another kind of work that brings us pleasure. Playing sport is work in a very fundamental sense. It requires practice, effort, concentration. And, as I said at the beginning of this interview, I cook for leisure. I know many people, in fact, my partner, who is out walking the dog at the moment, she views cooking as hard labor. I view it as a great joy. So our definitions about what is work and what isn't work are compartmentalized into, certainly in Western Europe, our jobs, things that we have to do and things that we choose to do, things that we choose to expend our time and energy on. Now, very occasionally, people have jobs where all those things converge. There are many people in the world for whom they've found work that they love. For many other people, they have tried to learn to love the work that they have found, but they have struggled to do so. And that is what accounts for a great deal of the disengagement in many institutions of people that, for example, in the Gallup survey, said that they were disengaged with their work. Now, why is this the case? Well, I think it's the case for several reasons. The first one is the expectation around us. It's a question about how we organize our economies. Now, we organize our economies on the assumption, and this is a sort of broader sociological idea, that everybody is expected to have a job to play their part in our societies. If you don't have a job, you don't get money, you therefore can't get housing, you're effectively left out, you're not contributing or participating, even when there's not a great deal of work to do. And we have been through successive technological revolutions, and yet each time we've been through one of these revolutions, we've been extraordinarily creative in coming up with things for people to do, building these massive complex bureaucracies. And I think, for example, in terms of academia, where in the 30 years I've been in academia, I've watched our administrative staffs expand from being around 20% of the university contingent to now well over 50%. To watch these vast expansion of bureaucratic process-based jobs, which are not particularly rewarding or satisfying. And I think part of it is that we are desperate to find work for people to do because simply we organize our economies and our societies around us. This also means that many of the jobs that we create tend to be very process-based. They tend to be based on creating more labor. And indeed, in many jobs, certainly in my few years as a sort of senior corporate executive at De Beers, the art of promotion, the art of gaining power and influence and wealth in companies like that was basically to try and create work that made people think you were invaluable. So part of the art was to be able to create and build additional processes, additional structures and put them in there. And that is, again, a question of sort of how we organize our societies in terms of incentives and how we organize our economies in terms of how we reward people and what we expect them to do. But this does speak to a more fundamental problem, which is, as you mentioned, what David Graeber called the efflorescence of bullshit jobs. Jobs that are not really necessary, don't add a great deal to the lives of the people who perform them. In fact, often don't serve any purpose other than giving them something to do in order to earn the money that they need to do to make a basic living. So in other words, it's responding to a societal impulse. And when we look sort of historically, and we take that sort of deep historical view, it involves a process of effectively taking people away from the kind of work that they feel very keen on doing. Now, it's a really interesting period of time in the 1920s when you had the efficiency movement kicking in the United States and the beginnings of sort of mass, well-organized industrialization, experiments at the factory at Ford and so on and so forth. When the unions started to protest against industrialization, and not when I say industrialization, I mean the efficiency process, the breaking down of structures into people doing small repetitive tasks. What they did, their complaint was not the fact that this would make factories more productive, which it did, or businesses more profitable, which it did. Their complaint was that it effectively would rob employees of what pleasure they get out of mastering a particular set of skills. So again, we use the example of the Ford factory, where up until 1921 or 1922, workers in the Ford factory, pretty much everybody who was building those Model T Fords or the early versions of the Model T Ford, could fix anything on a motor car. They could build a car from beginning all the way through to the end, have this holistic, skilled, artisanal knowledge of what they were doing. Subsequently, after the modernization of the process, people could be entirely unskilled because all they had to do was one particular task, which was whether it was to do a set of rivets, whether to put on a set of wheels and so on. So there was this sort of robbing of the laborer of this kind of virtue that comes out of mastering a skill profoundly well. And it's very interesting to see that in recent years, in particular in countries like the United Kingdom, where, you know, we have a famously bad culinary tradition, and our food is famously awful, partially because we embraced, after the Second World War, we embraced, for example, industrialized bread production in such a way that one of the things that has happened sort of bizarrely in the last 10 years is this great efflorescence of artisanal food industries, again, as a kind of reaction of people looking for work that is meaningful to them, where it involves applying skills that they have developed and evolved and mastered. There's a great joy in mastery. And this is something that's missing for so many people from their jobs. And it's interesting, again, in terms of looking at how the job market process has evolved over the last, in particular, 20 or 30 years, where you went from having a job for life, and again, I use the example of my former company, De Beers, the diamond miner, where, you know, certainly up until the 1990s, people would go there and they'd work there from beginning to end, and they'd become, you know, utterly attuned with that particular industry and that particular business. In 1990 and beyond, as in many other businesses, in particular amongst the managerial class, suddenly you ended up with this process of great lateral movement. Somebody would come in from entirely different industries. People began to move laterally. So you ended up losing that kind of extraordinary expertise, that skill, that kind of passion, that sense of being and belonging that made the work meaningful. And you ended up with the fact what, you know, is a sort of highly mobile managerial class whose primary work focus tends to be on themselves. And that again creates and amplifies the sort of sense of disillusionment, because part of the purpose and joy of working in a company or working with others is this idea of sharing a common bond and a set of common ambitions. And again, this is a sort of very base human response to things. We are social animals. We are bound together in community, and we find real value in doing that. And it is interesting when you talk about the Gallup poll, you know, when the interviews were conducted with the 80% of people who describe themselves as disengaged by their jobs, they actually often describe themselves as, you know, the only reason beyond their paycheck that they went into work was the fact that they could go and be disengaged with other people. In other words, that have a community of discontent to be a part of, and that they could go. So you could, if you're working in the Amazon warehouse, you know, Amazon employees might be able to sit and stare and form a sense of community by bitching about their managers or Jeff Bezos in Seattle or what have you.
Well, fantastic, James, fantastic. Well, I have just one more question. Actually, I have many more, but we're going to start to rotate here the questions, and then I'm going to hand over to Angela, who is also the coordinator of risk programs. But I'd like just to dig deeper now on your personal journey in the corporate world, James, you know, because as far as I could understand, it seems that you had a 6-year stint in the corporate world by becoming the global head of public affairs of De Beers, you know, this huge African-British corporation specializing in mining, diamond mining, right? Trading and so on. And could you share with us how was this, I would say, unusual experience for an anthropologist? What have you learned? What is the culture, worldview, and the rules, you know, of survival, let's say this way, prevalent in the business world from the lens of an anthropologist? Were you engaged or disengaged at the end?
Well, actually, look, it is an interesting question. I'll try. I'll tell you that. A very quick story of how I got involved was De Beers have its biggest diamond mines in the Kalahari Desert. And beginning in the late 1990s, and what ended up a sort of very high-profile court case and so on, De Beers got accused by an NGO in the UK of trying to remove indigenous Khoisan hunter-gatherers from their traditional homeland in the Central Kalahari Game Reserve, to make way for diamond mining. Now, this wasn't true, but the campaign against De Beers was very effective, and it involved, sort of touched on many complex issues. And one of them being that De Beers' richest mines are in Botswana, where these relocations happened, and they were affected by the government, and it was a really awful process. So 2 communities called the Griqua and the Ganakwe were forced out of their villages they'd lived in, or the area they'd lived in for, well, as long as history tells us is possible to have lived. De Beers got blamed partially because they have a 50-50 joint venture with the government of Botswana. So in other words, I mean, through various complicated measures, but it means that in Botswana, roughly 80 cents out of every dollar that De Beers made actually went to the government. And in Botswana, unusual amongst African countries, that government looked after the money very well and spent it very well. Schools, hospitals. It was the first African state with universal healthcare and universal education provided by the state and so on. There were lots of complicated things. And anyway, De Beers approached me as an anthropologist who was working with those communities and who saw the potential damage caused by this campaign against De Beers in particular. They approached me and asked if I would help them. And in the early 2000s, very few companies had community policies or sustainability policies or outspoken commitments where they would do things. And this was my particular thing, where they would only operate on the basis of having achieved the free, prior, and informed consent of local communities. So this conflict focused De Beers' attention very much on the need to ensure that their relationship with communities where they were working, and it wasn't just, they had, for example, mines in Canada where they're indigenous communities as well, but it focused their attention on the need to have a set of community policies and clear commitments that could be assured and evaluated and observed. And they recruited me to join in that space. And I did, and I discovered, like a good anthropologist, I learned my way around very quickly, and I did quite well and got promoted very quickly. But I have to say, after 4 or 5 years at De Beers, start to get very bored. I discovered that the work I was doing was all the same, that many of the meetings I was attending, whether it was from the Davos like meetings of the World Economic Forum to the mining indabas and so on, to the kind of rhetoric I'd be engaging in at the State Department, actually all started to feel the same. It began to feel slightly hollow. I also began to wonder about questions about myself, is where for the first decade of my life and more, I had always focused on working for causes. And these causes were all relating to the Khoisan people that I'd been working with, whether it was land rights, labor rights, and conservation issues, so on and so forth, many different issues. Once I'd been in De Beers, I realized I'd begun to sort of absorb this kind of corporate culture. And one of the phenomena, one of the side effects of absorbing about this corporate culture was I began to think about my bonus far more than I began to think about the job. And I began to think about my promotions, and I began to think about my options. I was like, how might I be able to be CEO and so on. And I noticed that there was this sort of change. It affects this kind of change in value and values. And this is partially a question of corporate culture, but it is also part of the culture of corporations. And you also I began to start thinking on things, and I did really quite well at it for a long time. You start thinking of expanding your empire if you're in a senior management role, because that is how you get more power and more money. And so anyway, after 6 years of it, I decided I'd had enough, and the fortunate opportunity, De Beers got taken over by Anglo-American. And that provided an excellent opportunity for me to leave and return to doing the work that I really cared about, and that brought me satisfaction. And so I immediately packed my bags and departed for the Kalahari again to start working with those communities, and at the same time spending my spare time, because I didn't, as an unknown author, nobody paid me anything for my first book. Also writing the first book, which was, again, a kind of very difficult work. As I was going to say, writing a book is one of the most horrendous things you can do. I don't recommend it to anybody unless they want to be miserable and lonely for a long time. But once it's done, it's very rewarding. And you should only do it if you've got something you feel is important to say. But certainly I shifted away from a job which I felt increasingly focused on power, money, and prestige, to doing one which was focused on, providing satisfaction for myself, which involved working on issues which were spiritually important, but at the same time made me feel better about myself and, of course, my relationships with the people that I really cared about, which are the communities who I continue to work with in Southern Africa. So there is in that a sort of slight moral. I will add also the caveat that the only reason I was able to do that, and again, this is sort of one of the things that I think about when we start looking at how we organize our economies for the future in a world where, assuming we haven't destroyed everything, but it's a hyper-productive world where we've got AI doing tons of stuff, how do we distribute the resources we have to in order to enable the most people to flourish? And I recognized I was only able to go and return and write my book and focus on that and return to doing direct land rights work with communities, because at that stage, by then, I had 2 children, and the only reason I could afford it was because I'd actually spent 6 or 7 years working in the corporate world. If I continued doing what I did before my corporate life, I wouldn't have been able to. As I said, when I joined De Beers, all I own is a battered truck, a rifle, and a cooking pot.
We identify very much with your story, James. And actually, I see in one of your interviews that your brother continued in the corporate ladder and became the CEO of the Gates and Melinda Foundation. So he's the CEO of the whole foundation. It's impressive. Yes. So
that's it. He flies around in Bill Gates' jet.
He is at the World Economic Forum for sure.
Well, actually, he's stopped going.
Oh.
He didn't go this year. I laughed. I asked him if he was going to go. And he says he's had enough of it. But yes, he's, you know, but again, I mean, I have to say, in fairness, you know, he's leader of a very big organization, a $90 billion organization. But again, I have to say, he does share with me a great sense of purpose. And he works there rather than, he could very easily move to a much better paid job. But yes, I do not envy the corporatization of his life at all.
So Angela, please.
Okay. Well, Professor Suzman, thank you so much again for being with us. It's a great pleasure and honor to have you here. My question is about the meaning, also the meaning of work. And in Latin, the first meaning of work is tripalium. It means torture instrument, right?
Right.
And just for the slaves and just for other people to do not me. And I wondered, what have you learned in the hunter-gathered people about the spiritual view of work and the sense of interbeing and this interrelation with everyone working together? Did you see a pattern? Because everyone wants a pattern, right? Did you see a pattern of a sense of spirituality in their work or the interbeing in their work?
The answer to that question is both yes and no. I mean, one of the really surprising things about hunter-gatherer societies like the Smuts is that while to the outside view, everybody eats the same food, everything is shared, there's incredible sort of constant social engagement, chitter-chatter, movement of people, generosity, there's no hierarchy whatsoever. So men and women are of equal status, children play in mixed age groups, and so on and so forth. So those societies in many ways look like what you might say certainly in Europe, many what we'd call communitarian organizations or groups aspire to be like. And they set up their communities on a remote farm somewhere and try and emulate.
Egalitarian.
And it's all about the focus on the community, and there's lots of spiritual activities within it. Now, the irony is that within the Smuts world, everybody's fiercely individualistic, actually. There's this kind of opposite thing. Everybody is very, Smuts are, in a way, they like the ultra-libertarians. They do not accept anybody else's authority. So in a society where nobody accepts anybody else's authority, you have a society, ironically, where everything is shared, everybody's absolutely equal, and nobody does anything to annoy or upset anybody else. So they don't have this very powerful sense of community as an abstract thing, but they do have this ongoing set of social relations which are maintained. And the outcome of this kind of being very strongly individualistic is a very tightly bound society where people do cooperate constantly. Responsibility is shared, resources are shared, risks are shared, opportunities are shared. So that's a sort of, it's a kind of interesting inversion of the typical way we think about it. Now, in terms of the spirituality and work, this is again where, the Smuts do have a word for work called palasi. And certainly in the traditional sense, it was used to talk about the activities of hunting and gathering. But some days you could have, hard work and unpleasant work, and other days you could have pleasant work. Now, in particular, I talked a little bit when I mentioned earlier that men works 2 hours more a week on average than women. It's because responsibilities are split between the hunters and the gatherers. So everybody gathers, men and women, but only men typically would undertake large-scale hunts. And these could be very demanding processes that would go over 2 days. So often when we talked about men working 17 hours in a week, on average, they might actually, over a period of 10 days, spend 48 hours out in a hunt, but then not do anything for another 10 days afterwards.
Okay.
But it's the way people talk about that process of hunting. And again, it's something, you know, I write about it much more detail, and I talk about it quite often. When we talk about, when they describe hunting, so I'll use a quote from a hunter. I hope I don't butcher it, because I haven't used the quote for a while. But, you know, one man who was a, you know, really great hunter, and he'd go and hunt, and, you know, going out for them was with them was absolutely exhausting. But when they came back, and they'd relax and not think about anything for days, and I'd be like, "Oh, don't you get bored?" He says, "When I've been on a hunt, I come back with, you know, my legs are heavy, my heart is happy, and my belly is full." And there's this sense of great accomplishment that comes out of doing the work that they did, this real sense of being. And the truth is that hunting in the Kalahari is an incredible activity, which is intellectually engaging, physically engaging. It requires thought, anticipation. It requires a degree often of cooperation. And it ticks all those boxes. When you do it, you feel great. And there is a reason why I think in our world today that one of the principal leisure activities, and certainly in countries like the United States, one of the principal leisure activities is hunting and fishing. People go and try and get this sort of faint hint for, you know, they'll go and work their terrible daytime jobs for 60 hours a week so they can spend whatever the $200 they need to spend on the weekend to go and catch a fish and get some sort of hint of that satisfaction that their hunter-gatherer ancestors had. Of course, when hunter-gatherers see that, and we do get in the Kalahari now in the communities I work with, one of the ways that they actually gain income is foreign hunters come in to hunt, and they pay a huge amount of money, which we then use in turn for the communities to maintain water points, community functions, so on and so forth. But the Smuts themselves are bewildered by this. Why on earth do these people work 50 years, 50 weeks in a year doing their otherwise terrible jobs just in order so that they can come and spend 2 weeks of holiday doing what for Smuts is considered the hardest work? So it's a very sort of complex space, but I think the fundamental thing with them is that the work they did was immediately rewarding. You know, for many of us, the rewards from our work come at the end of the month. Certainly the spiritual, the material rewards come. You know, we work today for something which will have an outcome in the future. When we go to school, we work for a degree in 3 years' time. Everything we do is focused on the distant future. They got immediate rewards from the activities that they do. And again, I think this is why, for example, I like cooking, is it's one of the few forms of activity that I can do when my rewards are immediate. You know, after the 2 hours of sitting chopping things in my kitchen, I actually get the rewards of my labor immediately rather than in the form of a sort of paycheck at the end of the year.
Mm-hmm.
Wow,
Thank
great.
you.
So, Alessandra, please.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Professor Suzman, for sharing your amazing experience in life. It's a pleasure to hear from you. I'd like to hear your thoughts a little bit more. There was some thinking and talking here around bullshit jobs and jobs that don't mean anything and unfulfilling jobs. With our AI, with artificial intelligence now being a thing, and some people now studying and providing some clarification on trying to treat artificial intelligence as a tool, a structured tool. Let's compare to electricity, for example. I can choose not to use, but it doesn't make a lot of sense nowadays. So with this being from now on, considered as a structured tool, can we see, or is it too naive to see that perhaps artificial intelligence in the end is going to be a good thing in terms of making our work, our jobs more, I will risk using the word human, knowing where I am, so correct me, of course. But because we're going to get rid perhaps of automated things, and we're going to go back to when working was being more creative, was being more meaningful and trying to make a difference. So I'd like to hear your thoughts around this new path that may seem in the future, perhaps a good thing.
Well, I think like many people, when certainly the ChatGPT models became publicly available, I was initially shocked and quite amazed at the capabilities. It is a write a Shakespearean style sonnet about picking peas in the garden, and out it would come in the blink of an eye, far better than anything I could do in the same time period. Look, I struggle to understand the implications of AI, as I think many of us do right at the moment. It is such a new thing that being able to chart out the potential implications in terms of how we organize our working lives and what work, in fact, we do, I think is very challenging. And I think it's interesting, one area I'm particularly interested in looking at and understanding more as, and certainly one community of people who I'm really interested in understanding more, are the views of artists, musicians, and other creatives on the capabilities of AI and what they do, whether it can write a great piece of music. And then you start asking yourself, because these are the kind of jobs that when people imagine the post-industrial era where we'd work very little, John Maynard Keynes, Bertrand Russell, Oscar Wilde even, all imagined that we'd be spending our time engaged in what he called higher activities, philosophizing, making art, making music, writing books, doing all these creative things with the work that he didn't consider to be work, but to be the sort of joyful expression of what it means to be human. And AI poses, I think, some very difficult philosophical questions about that. We know that the poem that the ChatGPT might write for me lacks soul, but it certainly doesn't lack accomplishment in some sense. And I think this is something that's going to take us a long time to navigate and negotiate. I think there's the separate question is, I think in terms of doing other kind of what I'd call task-based jobs outside the creative one, I do think AI has the capability to, certainly in a material sense, radically improve the material quality of some aspects of our lives. And we see this already in medicine and many other spaces which require analyzing and applying huge bodies of data, and being able to do it in a fairly creative way. So certainly in terms of diagnostics and so on, AI has been doing really remarkable things. And I likewise think in terms of processes, when I think back to my period in the diamond mining business, and I think, I was ostensibly, as head of public affairs, I was doing politics and communications. But actually, I keep looking at the ChatGPT, and I was thinking, instead of me asking my head of comms to produce 5 key messages, echoing a point, I actually imagine ChatGPT could do that damn well. If I fed it sort of 10 years of De Beers annual reports and I said, come up with 5 key messages to talk about at this kind of shareholder meeting based on this, it would do an extremely good job. I think what it does is it forces us to ask a bigger question about, assuming that AI does have the potential to take over many what I call tasks in business. So regardless of its creative implications in terms of whether it can do something with soul or not, where it can do tasks. And those tasks are no longer necessarily done as economically by people or as enjoyably. And certainly, I'd imagine it would create the capability for the 80% of the disengaged workforce to disengage even further and maybe spend time doing something else. And I think the questions that raise are far more profound in that they come to the heart of how do we organize the fruits of the labor done by machines. And I think that really is the key question that is going to face us in future. At the moment, what we have, and we've been able to see this process over the last century, and it's been one very clearly linked to automation and industrialization, has been the diminishing value of human labor relative to machines. And it's been a very constant curve going upwards since the first glimmerings of industry. Now, what this means is that it means that when human labor is diminished, it generates, certainly in terms of the way we organize our economy, far less wealth, and it accumulates wealth and power in the hands of those who effectively own the machines one way or the other. And certainly we see this more and more as our economies become more technologized. And in particular, we look at recent things such as the boom in particular around social media and so on, and the huge wealth generated, I think emblematic of a broader process where the more machines do work, the more wealth is created through the ownership and transfer of capital, rather than the ability to work hard. And I think many of the problems that we see when we look, for example, in the United States at the moment, this kind of bifurcation that's happening in politics, I do think indeed, that there is a big disillusioned, and increasingly it's looking like a majority in the United States for whom the American dream has ceased to be the American dream because they can't work themselves to the level of richness, but they imagine that what's subverting that process tends to be a deep state conspiracy and so on and so forth. But I think these phenomena we're seeing at the moment are very much a result of the fact that as a society, we have not yet come to grips with the challenge of how we reorganize, how we distribute, how we engage with the products of the labor, which is increasingly done by machines. And at the moment, what the outcome is that we're seeing these vast agglomerations of wealth in very few hands. I think, again, if I use my sort of De Beers invocation, the man who brought me into De Beers was the chairman, who in 2000 was among the 30 richest people in the world. I think he now doesn't even make it into the list of the top 1,000. I think there's been this vast surge in wealth, and concentrated in very few hands because it is most of the work that is done now. The computer, the machine we are talking on now, the number of calculations it is doing simply to enable this meeting or this network of machines that work is just unthinkable. This is, it's a level, if this was, mathematicians sitting in the library in Alexandria, processing all the calculations that are happening right at this moment, done in the flick of an eye by our machines, it would take them 1,000,000 years. We're getting billions of computations every second. So, and this is, again, all done by these machines.
Wow. Yeah. James, can we have time, please, for 3 more questions here? The 3 ones with
yes. What time?
Yes.
Yes. I think I can last I can do another 10 minutes. I've got somewhere to be at 3 o'clock.
Okay, fantastic. Mauro, please.
I don't mind going on a little bit longer, of course.
Thank you.
Hey, thank you, Alexandre. My question is a little bit on the sidelines of the matter of work, but you described a lot the societies and how they allocate their time. And my question has to do with religion. To which extent religion has evolved as part of the allocation of time, whether you see from your observations religion being something for good or for evil in terms of cohesion or people killing each other, and whether it would make sense to say that in our current society, maybe the time we allocated to religion gave way to time allocated to work, and we were left sort of some fringe aspects of religion which are particularly toxic.
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I can answer it in lots of different ways. But I think I'll try and stick to the fundamental things, because of course there's this sort of huge chapter in the history of work. You had the so-called the emergence of the Protestant ethic, which I sort of debate in the book as to whether it was that. I claim all, religions often embraced work as a form of virtue. But anyway, let me start with a sort of broad idea about what religion is. Interestingly, with hunter-gatherers and with, I think, many other cultures as well, I often say Jnwasi did not have religion. And when I say they did not have religion, they did not have this external conceptual category of a series of activities or ideas that constituted religion as distinct from the rest of their life. So their lives were certainly not unspiritual. They talked endlessly, and things like various forms of spirits and gods and all sorts of other things were constantly active in day-to-day life. So people were unlucky with hunting. It would involve either meddling of a dead spirit or, possibly even the gods, because the Jnwasi's gods were not particularly they were very human gods. They were kind of a bit like, if we think about sort of the ancient, or some of the ancient Greco-Roman deities. They were potentially spiteful, avaricious, could be kind, could be so on. So for Jinwasi, religion wasn't a conceptual category of the world outside there. It was a way of making sense of the world around them. And again, it wasn't very specifically something that, there was no worship involved. Jinwasi never worshipped their gods. They would occasionally try and talk to them, to beg with them to stop being so difficult or doing something terrible. But there was no idea of worship. I think worship and idea actually came about with the agricultural revolution. And you'll have to now read the whole book to understand sort of how the agricultural revolution shaped these ideas, or what I think the agricultural revolution did in terms of shaping ideas about the virtuousness of work. When you talk about the sort of work taking up time that was spent in religion, broadly, I think, religion serves many different purposes for us. I think in terms of, for many people, it gives them a sense of belonging, community, and a sense of deep spiritual satisfaction and connectedness, not just with other people, but with the universe around them. I am certainly not a religious man in that sense, but I absolutely understand and recognize and see and feel actually quite envious sometimes of that sense of being, belonging, community, and indeed moral certainty that comes out of being part of a religious community. I also think you're absolutely right in the sense that in many places work has begun to substitute for religion. So where people might have devoted their lives to prayer and service to a religious goal in the past, they now might do work. And certainly in the United States, in Manhattan, work is a kind of religion. People can't think of, it is the framework around which every aspect of their lives is organized. So it's very difficult to pass the two from each other. But I think when I start looking at the world in terms of sort of broader virtues of activities that we constitute as religious, the kind of ritual, the ceremonies, the communality, I do think work taking that away from people has been a damaging phenomenon, and one to which I kind of hope that we'd return in the future. I do. And I should say again, John Maynard Keynes also made very specifically the case that, when machines liberate us from doing work, he did imagine that in addition to philosophizing and doing art and so on, that religion would become a far greater focus. Now, yes, certainly in terms of the sort of the rewards of religious life, I certainly imagine that there would be a great deal more happiness that would come from the certainty that comes from being able to engage in the world or get things which at least certainly religion has traditionally provided. And I don't think the way we organize our work is in any way capable of doing that on a mass scale.
Wow. So last one, Maristela, please go ahead. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. And thank you, Professor. And being an economist here, I really love it, lots of things, from your books, for sure. I'm tagging along on Mauro's point, which is on religion, in the sense, how do we see us heading from here in the workspace? Because we come from there was a possibility of decreasing the number of hours we work, and then Americans in a way of no, I prefer to work more and be able to consume more. But then at the same time now you have this huge frustration with the workplace. And then at the same time, you show us that from the Gallup numbers, there may be a 20-30% people are okay with their jobs in the UK, in the US, and Canada, where you have more Protestants. And in Asia, it's at the lowest in the single digits. So tagging along on the point of religion, how do you see it? Because at the same time, I see a big clash that you have in Africa, the Chinese with the locals in Africa saying, oh, you are lazy, you don't work, you go to the church on Sunday. So they have their mentality, Asians, of working 7 days a week, 6 days a week at least. But then maybe because they cannot go too far, because Jack Ma cannot make too much, because then he disappears. So how do we see us, sorry for the question, but how do you see us heading from here as humans?
I honestly don't know. I mean, this is, I think, you know, the one thing that I'm constantly reminded of when trying to write a history of the world is of the need to be utterly humble and say, I have no idea where things are going on. I'm constantly surprised by basically our species and by the way our world is changing. I mean, if you'd asked me a decade ago whether I'd predict we'd be in any of the situations, major predicaments that we're in at the moment, I would probably say no. I would not have imagined Trump would have been president of America. I would not have imagined Britain would have left the European Union. I certainly wouldn't have imagined Russia had invaded Ukraine. And I certainly would have imagined the awful scenes we're seeing now from, you know, Palestine and Gaza. I also wouldn't have imagined, I mean, the list of things I wouldn't have imagined are huge. So I'm very wary about making any predictions, you know, beyond saying, you know, I am hopeful. I think we have all the capabilities and mechanisms possible in place. I think we have the collective wisdom and indeed the collective spirit, when we channel it correctly, to make a really decent world for ourselves. And indeed, it's the sort of subject of my next book, is sort of to begin to maybe map out an idea of how we might go about doing this. And I'm looking very specifically at what you might call a non-economic history of the world. So I'm looking at, for if you're an economist, you know, my starting point are many of the game theory problems about freeloaders, things like the stag hunt and so on. And because these play out very, very differently if you start doing them in a hunter-gatherer world. And activities, the question of sharing, you know, how do we share resources and then responsibilities and ideas? So my new book is a history of sharing. It's called An Uneconomic History of Sharing, Giving and Taking. And I'm trying to work my way through those particular challenges. Just sort of, you mentioned the sort of different attitudes in China and so on, and of course Africa. Certainly in Africa, I think, you know, we do have a distinct, you know, sort of distinct working cultures that are very different. And again, I think it's one of the things that has sort of shaped my thinking on this is looking at, you know, for example, the concept of a job was very much, certainly in the countries I've lived and worked in, Botswana, Namibia, South Africa, was very much for much of the population this kind of colonial construct that you have to get a job. And a recent one, there was a degree of unfamiliarity. And people there are massively, you know, if you go to Namibia, where I spend most of my time, you go into any, not just government office, but even private sector office, everybody's eyes are rolling during the workday and they're trying to sneak out. And they, I mean, interestingly, they're actually just about to make a law on the 4-day week there, which is very amazing. But there, you know, and certainly I think people's attitudes to jobs have been shaped by historical circumstances. And I think certainly when you go to the East Asia, there's a far greater historical, deep culture-based, you know, which is reflected, I suppose, in the Confucian worldview, or the sort of Confucian ideal of collective responsibility. And I think that shapes people's attitudes to work in a very profound way and is very different from what happens in other places. You know, I certainly felt when I was writing about Japan and China, for example, in my book, that actually was the one thing that I felt almost embarrassed to write about, because I don't think I have a significant enough appreciation of that sort of Confucian side. But yes, we don't know the future. As I say, I'm not optimistic, but I am deeply hopeful, because I really feel that, you know, we do have the absolute, you know, in particular aided by AI and so on, we have the human and material resources to be able to, I think, you know, create a sustainable future which works for pretty much everybody. Whether we have the heart to do so and the spirit to do so, these sort of obtuse quantities, I'm not certain.
Wow, fantastic, James. Yeah, this gap between our increasingly greater power, technological power and everything, with unfortunately a lower investment on our collective wisdom and heart, as you mentioned, and spirit. It's our main source of concern. So that's why we're here too. And James, it's been a lot of food for thought. We are deeply grateful once again for your generosity in taking your time to be with us. We for sure would need more sessions like this to keep, unraveling and understanding so many of these deep issues that were raised here. So I'll not say this was once in a lifetime opportunity. Hopefully, we would like to see you once again in the future, so we can learn and listen more from you. And thank you so much on behalf of the group once again. It was a memorable occasion for everyone. So thank you so much, James. And a round of, not the AI applause, the real applause.
The real applause. Okay.
Yes, look, thank you very much for having me. And I've got to say, I've been, I'm humbled and very gracious for the quality of the questions and the quality of the thinking, and it is good. I learn as much from these gatherings as I hope anybody listening to me talk does. In fact, I'm sure they learn more. My wife thinks I have nothing useful to offer the world anymore. She's so bored with me talking. She's probably right. She's much cleverer than me. So,
so thank you once again, James. See you.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. See you. Bye-bye.
Have a great day.